This is to Tim Wilson. Tim, the Liberal Party just won the unwinnable election that even the secular press acknowledged as a miracle, and it was. But unbeknownst to them, there has been a huge groundswell of united prayer and fasting that has gone across our nation, the whole nation, the likes of which I have never ever witnessed before. Perhaps Israel Folau's sacking influenced some people, but the two major concerns for us were religious freedom being taken away and also the parents' rights being taken away. So my question to you, Tim, is what is the Liberal Party going to do to address these issues?
Tim Wilson.
Well, first, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. I don't think it was an unlosable election or an unwinnable election for any party, and that's been shown clearly, but nonetheless, I'm happy with the result. And
so not an actual miracle, Tim?
It was millions of Australians who came together and voted for the type of country we want to be, and I want to express my thanks to the people of Goldstein for re-electing me as well. But freedom of conscience is core to the Liberal cause. The idea that people should be free to decide how to live their life is a foundation principle of everything I believe in. Now, I know there are many people who are concerned about religious freedom and their freedom to exercise their faith. Sometimes it can be, legitimately threatened, and sometimes people like to rally to causes. As you may know, there was a report commissioned by the previous government or the previous parliament into freedom of religion, and we referred it to the Australian Law Reform Commission to look at how to address some of the tensions that exist in law, because Australian anti-discrimination legislation, which is often the basis of these concerns, was frankly designed at a time where freedom of religion transcended the rights of other minority groups within the community, particularly LGBTI Australians. And I think we need to look and review at that law to improve it so that everybody's rights are protected rather than just trying to tinker with existing laws. So if you're watching from the Australian Law Reform Commission, a different approach and a way at looking comprehensively at change of law is what we're looking for, and that will ultimately decide what we're going to do in terms of reform.
Now, Tim, how soon do you expect the Prime Minister to appoint a Religious Freedom Commissioner, as he's promised to do?
Well, any appointment of any commissioner to the Australian Human Rights Commission has to be done through a piece of legislation. So I don't know the time frames on that, but would you expect
it to be pretty quick, given what Ruth McKie has just said about the expectations that may have been built up during this campaign from religious communities?
Well, when I was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, I, as part of the package of dealing with human rights issues, included freedom of religion as part of that, as freedom of conscience, as well as freedom of speech, as well as the rights of LGBTI Australians. I think that the existing Human Rights Commissioner can cover those areas in the meantime and make sure they're given voice, but obviously we'll wait and see the legislation.
You'd expect the Prime Minister to deliver on this promise, that's the point?
Well, I'm expecting the Prime Minister to deliver on all of our promises, which covers...
No, that one in particular.
Well, I've just said that, which includes all of our promises and including making sure that currently under federal legislation there's no protection for discrimination on the basis of religion. Okay. That will include that as well. Let's
just quickly go back to Ruth McKie. Ruth, do you feel there's an expectation that the government will move quickly to do something to protect, in your view, freedom of religion?
I think so. There certainly was an expectation, and it's quite a majority of people out there, and not just Christian people. Other people are concerned about particularly parents' rights being taken away from them.
OK, the next question is related. I'm going to go to that before I bring in the rest of the panel. It's from Judy Wilkenfeld. Judy.
My question is directed to Mark Dreyfus. Chris Bowen admitted last week that the Labor Party has a serious problem with religious voters. Given Labor's disastrous loss in last week's election, including the loss of votes from faith-based electorates and voters, will the Labor Party be reviewing their current policy of removing the protections in the anti-discrimination legislation that currently protects faith-based organisations and schools?
Go ahead.
Thanks, Judy, for the question. And perhaps the starting point would be to make the point to you that it is a bipartisan commitment to remove the exemption that presently exists for lesbian and gay students in religious schools. It's a promise that Mr Morrison made to the people of Australia during the Wentworth by-election, that exemption would be removed. And it's a promise that, like many promises Mr Morrison's made, he hasn't yet kept. But I'll say this too. The Ruddock Review, which Tim Wilson referred to before but didn't name, concluded that religious freedom in Australia is not in imminent peril. Now, I agree with that conclusion. I don't think that there is any present great risk to religious freedom, notwithstanding a whole lot of fear campaigns that were, along with other fear campaigns, run during this election campaign we've just had. In working with Mr Morrison to remove the exemption for students in religious schools, an exemption that came to light because of the Ruddock Review, and many people around Australia expressed shock that there was such an exemption still in our law, I worked, as is appropriate in my role as Shadow Attorney General, with church leaders, with leaders from mosques and synagogues and leaders of religious schools to make sure that we get this right and that the removal of the exemption is done in an appropriately respectful way.
Okay, you're just on your minute, so I'm going to...
Thanks, Tony. It's a complicated topic, but I want to assure you, Judy, that, and also Ruth, from your question before, that Labor will be working to make sure that there is an appropriate balancing of rights, and we'll be dealing with this in a very, very respectful manner. Now,
during the campaign, you did rule out appointing a Religious Freedom Commissioner. The Prime Minister is going to do that, evidently. Why did you rule it out?
There are already 8 commissioners in the Australian Human Rights Commission, and we didn't feel that it was necessary, particularly in light of the conclusion reached by the Ruddock Review, that religious freedoms, according to Mr Ruddock and his panel, are not in imminent peril.
Paul Kelly.
I think there's a difference here between what Mark Dreyfus has just said and what Chris Bowen said the other day. Chris Bowen's warning was a particularly strong warning. It was a considered warning. He actually said that he felt that faith-based communities believed that progressive politics was no longer working for them. And of course, we know the Labor Party's become a far more progressive party over recent years. We look at the swings against the Labor Party in Queensland, which is a socially conservative state with a lot of religious commitment, as someone like John Black, an election analyst, has pointed out. We look at Western Sydney, where we have a number of ethnically and devout communities. Again, there was a significant swing against the Labor Party there. So I think that essentially what's happened is Chris Bowen has issued a wake-up call to the Labor Party. I think Mark Dreyfus probably doesn't accept that call. He says correctly that the Ruddock Review said that religious freedom was not in peril. Well, at one level that is correct, but I think it's also very clear at another level that many faith-based communities in this country feel that they are under threat, they are under assault. Scott Morrison has said that he will introduce a Religious Discrimination Act. We saw at the end of last year there was a complete deadlock between the Labor Party and the government about how to balance these particular requirements between...
Paul, can I just interrupt you there just to see whether Mark Dreyfus whether the Labor Party in fact will change its mind on supporting such legislation. Bear in mind that ahead of the election, the lobby group Christian Schools Australia told parents with kids in such schools the federal election was the most critical for religious freedom in living memory.
Well, Mr Spencer of the Christian Schools Association, I think that's their name, has campaigned mightily for the Liberal Party for many years. He did some more of it at this election. And we don't accept that that's an appropriate way to proceed with a really difficult question. I don't accept what Paul Kelly's just tried to say, that I'm in some argument here with Chris Bowen.
I'm not saying you're in an argument. I'm saying that there's a difference. I'm saying there's a very clear difference of emphasis, it seems to me, between what Chris Bowen said earlier this week and what you just said. Now, I stand to be corrected, but it just seems to me that there is a clear difference of emphasis there.
It's not... Well, I'll go back to what Tony's saying. It's not a matter of take it or leave it on a piece of legislation. These are complex questions which require a balancing of rights. We have competing rights here, and all of the international human rights covenants recognise that there are competing rights which need to be balanced. So when the Prime Minister says during the Wentworth by-election he's going to remove an exemption that's been in the Sex Discrimination Act protecting religious schools in respect of lesbian and gay kids in their schools. He's going to remove it. He needs to bring legislation to the Parliament so that it can be debated. He never did.
Let's go to the other side of the
when
panel.
he does, we'll debate it. We'll debate it in a respectful way, and we'll debate it after consulting with absolutely everybody that's affected.
Rachel, what's your view? You're from Western Sydney, I might point out, and Western Sydney was just one of those areas where a high degree of religious community activism has been seen.
Sure, just to clarify, I work at Western Sydney University. I don't live in Western Sydney, just before anyone goes and fact checks that. So we have laws to protect religious freedom. It's enshrined in the Constitution, actually, so it is one of the strongest protections that we have. And I think it's really important when we talk about religious freedom that we talk about freedom of religious association for all Australians, and including the freedom not to associate with any religion is absolutely fine as well. It's really interesting when you hear about a Religious Freedom Commissioner. I hope that the issue of Islamophobia will be addressed as a result of that, because that's a particular community that's quite vulnerable at the moment. One of our questioners mentioned Israel Folau, and this is a really interesting touchstone for this issue. I think somebody like Israel Folau has demonstrated that he didn't get moved on for his religious views. He got moved on for expressing homophobic views. And there are many people who are religious who play sport, who are in rugby, who are outside of sport as well, who have personal, private views and still uphold the values of today, which is not to spread homophobic comments. And that was where Israel Folau's downfall lay. Not that he practiced his religion, but that he expressed a view that was out of step with his employer and out of step with community values, because they hurt a community that is already vulnerable. We know that gay and lesbian, and particularly trans Australians, are more at risk of mental health issues, are more at risk of suicide, because homophobia has been such a scourge in our community.
Can I just put that to Tim? I saw you nodding there, and here's a question: were you offended when Israel Folau said homosexuals, well, hell awaited homosexuals? Precisely what he said.
No, not in the slightest. And you know, the reality is...
So you don't think it's offensive to...
Oh, I'm sure it's offensive, but was I personally offended? Not at all. I mean, I think Israel Folau, respectfully, is a pretty bad role model. I don't look to sports stars as good role models. In fact, there have been lots of role models in sports who have done, frankly, horrific things at times, between drug and substance abuse, between sexual violence. And while I don't believe he's in that camp, I don't think he's a particularly good role model.
Is it because you don't believe in hell that you're not offended?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, I'm an agnostic person. I'm not a...
So if you're a Christian and homosexual, then the offence might be stronger.
Although you'd have to ask somebody who's Christian and homosexual, but I'm culturally Christian or Anglican, and even then it doesn't bother me in the slightest, because he has a right to express his view. The issue he has is, and it's a complex one, because there are issues around his contract and how it managed him, the commitments he made that he wouldn't repeat his pre-existing comments again. And I have general concerns both about how he conducts himself and, frankly, how Rugby Australia is conducted.
But you don't think there should be legislation to stop people saying what he said?
No.
OK. Marcia, what do you think generally about this issue? Religious freedom, the potential of the Prime Minister bringing in a Religious Freedom Commissioner, is it necessary?
I don't think it's necessary. I don't think religious freedom's imperilled in this country at all. On Israel Folau, it's a matter of contract law. He breached his contract, and his employer is entitled to dismiss him on the grounds that he breached his contract. He knew very well what his contract said, and I don't know why he thinks he should be exempt from his employment contract on the grounds of religion. So you see where this argument goes. Freedom of religion does not mean the freedom to persecute others. Freedom of religion does not mean the freedom to discriminate against others. And I think many Australians think freedom of religion means precisely that, the freedom to discriminate. And, you know, all this stuff about parents' rights, I find it very worrying that there's you know, a tinge of hysteria in the campaign to prevent education in schools to stop bullying. Bullying in schools has caused suicides. Now, and when it comes to homophobic bullying, we know just how damaging that is. We have a lot of information about that now. And any attempt to stop education to prevent bullying, I think, is an attack on freedom. It's the freedom of the victims who have to be considered in this case, not the freedom of those who want to discriminate and bully and harass children to death. I think the debate is hysterical in many parts of the country, and I don't accept the premise of the definition of freedom that's being floated here. I just don't accept it.
Paul, just come back to you very briefly. The debate's hysterical, says Marcia. Others disagree with your position. What do you think about that? I mean, how seriously should the Prime Minister pursue this, given what we're hearing from representatives of some religious communities?
Well, the Prime Minister's made a commitment. He will pursue it. This follows the Ruddock Review.
Mind you, the Ruddock Review did not recommend a Religious Freedom Commissioner. That's something that's just come out of the blue.
Sure. I mean, I think that we don't really have much of a debate about this issue at all. I think that a lot of people concerned about an assault on their faith or pressure on their faith are not speaking out about this. What we've seen in more recent times, of course, is we've seen senior representatives from the Christian churches and Christian schools going public and making comments and expressing their concern. So there's no doubt there is a problem. They feel under siege. Now, you can have a debate about whether they're exaggerating the problem or not, but there's no doubt that a lot of the religious institutions and people of religious faith feel that they are under pressure. Some of them feel that they are under siege. And this is a very difficult debate because it's about competing rights. So we need to have a calm and rational debate. We need to have a respectful debate. I hope we do have that debate, but I mean, essentially what's going to happen is the Prime Minister will proceed with his commitment to introduce a religious discrimination bill to try and get the balance right. But I think the final point to make is the Senate committee highlighted a couple of years ago, protections for religious freedom in this country are conspicuously weak.
OK, let's move on.